each of the chapters in my book, it corresponds to a theme of historical relevance to Assam.
But it's also a book of history, a book of political history of Assam, a book of social history of Assam, and a lot more. But I had no idea that there was an impact of the Opium Wars on Assam.
A British female anthropologist who chooses to travel all the way, not to like a very sort of glamorous, secure darbar of a mainland Raja, but she comes all the way to this frontier, wild country. So apparently, they went around town screaming China Zindabad. Assam is perhaps one of the most syncretic, pluralistic societies out there.
Hello everyone, you're watching Indian Express. Today we will be speaking about the beautiful state of Assam. Why, you might ask? Because there's a new book with a very fascinating title. It's called Color My Grave Purple. And it carries lots of stories about Assam. Uh, and what is fascinating about these stories is that it expands our worldview of the history of Assam. And that is what caught my attention over here. I am Adrija Roy Chaudhary, and I am joined by the author of this beautiful book, Shahnab Sahin. And to introduce Shahnab further, she was previously a civil servant working with the government of Assam. Then she moved to working as a humanitarian aide, and now she has donned a new hat, that of an author, with her brand new debut book. So, Shahnab, first tell me a little bit about this journey. Why an author from a civil servant and a humanitarian aid worker? Why did you decide to write short stories?
Thank you, Adrija, for this actually probably the most pertinent question, why I wrote the book. So I always say that, writing has been in my blood because my father was also a police officer by day and an author by night, is the way I always recall my father. He passed away when I was very young, when I was 16 years old. So in that sense, to write was always in the making in my life. But when life takes over, you don't know of the right moment to when to actually begin, but the universe leads you to a space where you know that it's time to start writing. For me, that time appeared in my life back in 2020 when COVID struck. At that point, I was a civil servant with the government of Assam, and I had a very tough job at that point as a frontline government worker. And there are also certain personal reasons I wasn't too happy in that job. I had a long stint in the development sector before that, and I was kind of in a space where I felt a bit misplaced. The concept of home itself, the concept of returning home, because people from my side of the world, we leave home to make a life, right? And then, I spent a long time outside of home, and then when I returned, certain reasonings made me feel not very at home. I couldn't really recognize it from the space where I was operating. So then I started writing, and I felt that calling that right now is the time, Shahnab, to start writing from memory. This is the time to sort of teach yourself about, or rather, sort of re-recognize home as what it meant for you. So that's when I began writing, and I would actually say that writing this book was an act of self-preservation, a preservation of a collective memory, and an exercise literally in soul survival.
Okay, that's a lovely answer.
Thank you.
I know I can understand that it came from a very personal space, but I must say after reading this book, I felt that it makes several, of course there's a lot of creativity involved in it, but it's also a book of history, a book of political history of Assam, a book of social history of Assam, and a lot more. So I want to understand this, that why did you think that you wanted to blend fiction writing and history, and how have you gone about that?
As I've already mentioned, my father was also an author. He wrote several novels, but he was mostly famous for his short stories. So this book is dedicated to my father. And so for my first work, I felt it just had to be somewhat of a daughter following her father's footsteps. That was one intentional design. Secondly, also the way that the work is formatted into 10 stories. This was again a very intentional design because I wanted to broaden the canvas of storytelling from my part of the world. Maybe it's not, a lot of people might not be happy to hear this, but based on my personal observation, we as it is don't have a lot of English language fiction writing that travels from my side of the world to the rest. And when it does, there's almost always an overemphasis on insurgency, violence, the state's response, the people's response to it, which of course is a lived reality of my region and my people, including myself. But at the same time, I felt that an overemphasis on this leads to a certain erasure of all the rest of the things that are worth talking about. Because I come from a region which is a mega biodiverse region of the world. We have multiple ethnicities cohabiting together. It's so beautiful in so many ways and means. And I just felt that it is time to broaden this canvas. So, which is why I went back in time. I went back in time to sort of highlight the different aspects of storytelling from a different era, which goes on until now. So, these are the two factors. So, the factors being that I wanted to follow in my father's footsteps of the first work being a collection of stories, which also opened the pathway to satisfy my other instinct, which was to broaden the narrative. And I'm a historian by academic training. So and I'm a history nerd, very proudly so. So it sort of brings all of these elements of love together into this book.
So I noticed, Shena, that in all of these chapters, you have also marked a date. There's 1858, there's 1921, then there's 1962. So what is the significance of each of these milestones, and why did you choose them for your stories?
Like I said, very deliberate design.
Hmm.
And I knew right from the beginning that this work is going to be a work of historical fiction. Now, with this genre, it's a bit complicated. It's beautiful, but it's a bit complicated because, I the historical bit of it allows me, or rather disallows me actually, from really changing facts of history. So this picking up of dates were inspired by my own love of history and my own love of returning back in time to sort of sieve stories about Assam in the larger, broader canvas of our nation's history. So that's why I went back in time through my research to highlight, underscore, read about events which were of a lot of significance to Assam in its historical making. So that's why, say, 1858, which is, my first story, is set in this timeline. So this is right in the aftermath of the revolt of 1857. And each of the chapters in my book, it corresponds to a theme of historical relevance to Assam. And also, in that sense, how Assam could be located in the broader historical narrative of the country. So, for instance, the first chapter, which is set in 1858, right in the aftermath of the First War of Independence, it helps locate Assam in that conversation around resistance to colonial rule. So, where I bring in a very real character, Maniram Diwan, one of our most reverential figures of modern Assamese history, very looked up to freedom fighter Maniram Diwan, but he was also instrumental in introducing to the British to the whole to tea. So basically, the whole orchestration of this colonial plantation empire was partly his contribution. So these are very real things that happen. These are very real characters, and I wanted to talk about these things, but through the tool of fictitious narratives, because that adds the zing. So I hope that the readers will also find this designing of the book interesting. Similarly, the second chapter, which is set in 1860, is a time where the colonial, the colonial policies were just growing and taking root in my side of the world. So, that was the date when the British actually banned the cultivation of opium
Mm.
privately. So these are incidents that happen and had a huge impact on the whole socio-cultural fabric of Assam.
Okay.
And I wanted to highlight them through my stories.
Actually, for each of these chapters, they opened up a worldview for me that I did not even know.
Mm, mm,
For instance, we read so much about the opium wars.
mm,
We know about the
mm,
triangular trade
mm,
between in Britain,
mm,
China, India, the
mm,
opium wars that had happened, but I had no idea that there was an
mm,
impact of the opium wars
mm,
on Assam,
mm,
which your first story
mm,
actually, that sort of
mm,
opened up this new worldview
mm.
for me, new understanding. Can you elaborate a little bit? How did you? What is the connection between the opium wars and Assam?
I mean, I would love to answer this question, because it answers more questions than most. Because you see, one of the intention was for me to also highlight the fact that we are much more connected than we are disconnected,
Hmm.
as earthlings in that
Hmm.
sense. And certain incidents of history, episodic incidents like colonialism, for instance, it connected. And not in very pleasing ways, it connected more than we are sort of attuned to understand. For instance, Assam is till now, I mean, it's a frontier part of the
Hmm.
country.
Hmm.
It's not part of the mainland narration, especially in the historical telling of the growth of our nation
Hmm.
in that sense. So I wanted to show through the first story that, look, you have something as astronomical at that point as the opium wars taking place. Okay, I call it astronomical because it had a huge impact on several societies, several layers of
Hmm.
societies. And that also had this very global event with a very global consequence. It also had its imprint in my very frontier part of the world.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
you see that this was such a diabolical colonial design to stop bullion from entering the British bullion from entering China. They designed this system wherein they were selling our opium. They were selling opium to the Chinese, completely addicting an entire nation to this substance, and then getting their tea. But then there was a response, of course. Then you have the two opium wars, which
Yeah.
was a reaction of the Chinese to this
Hmm.
very nefarious episode orchestrated by the colonizers. So you see, that is when somehow I felt even the universe was on their side for a while, where
Hmm.
incidentally Robert Bruce, he was a colonial agent. He was traveling to Assam. His brother Charles Bruce was also like a
Hmm.
researcher. And then our Maniram Diwan sort of orchestrated a meeting between Robert Bruce and the Singpho tribe, this tribal community from Assam, which were drinking tea wildly since ancient times. So the universe also brought this whole thing together for the British Empire at that point.
Hmm.
And that's when they realized that, okay, while all of this jhamela is going on in China, why don't we open the portal to another world which will benefit us? Because here you see, by luck, we have stumbled upon tea which we really need, and which is going to continue filling up our purses, and we've already subjugated this population, so why not open another portal? So you see, so their sort of designing of this entire colonial plantation economy in Assam was a derivative of
Hmm.
their already tested sort of policies in the rest of the world. So you see,
Okay.
like, we are more connected in that
Yeah.
sense than
Hmm.
disconnected.
You also mentioned somewhere that there's a large Chinese diaspora in Assam. One of the reasons
Mm.
being this connect with
Yes, yes.
China. Can you elaborate on that as
Yes,
well?
yes. I mean, we don't have as big of a diaspora now,
Hmm.
because I mean, this again calls for another episode probably
Yeah.
about this. But you see, when the tea plantation economy was established
Hmm.
in Assam, the first line of workers were also brought from China because they were already very, very trained in the
Hmm.
cultivation of tea. So a lot of these Chinese laborers had come to Assam. So we still have, so that is like the first, I mean, not first, I mean, this is one of the major links to the
Hmm.
Chinese diaspora.
Hmm. Hmm.
And up to a very recent past, until the Chinese aggression over our country, we had quite a sizable Chinese diaspora in this quaint little town called Makum in Upper Assam. So we
Okay.
have a district Tinsukia. So there's a location called Makum, and you had like Chinese language schools, you had food places and a vibrant diaspora,
Yeah.
Chinese diaspora. But unfortunately, when the war, the external aggression happened by China in the 60s, that was also a population that suffered the brunt. So a lot of them were relocated
Okay.
from Assam back to China, but that's not their home. This is diaspora politics,
Yeah,
which
yeah,
again opens a portal for another very long and complicated
yes,
conversation.
yes, yes.
But there was certainly this link that happened on account of the Chinese laborers coming in for initiating our plantation economy.
Okay. Then, in your second chapter, again, I found that very interesting how this same opium,
Mm,
the same poppy plant that was once, that was the prized possession of the British,
mm,
they suddenly ban it from
mm,
private sale
mm,
in Assam. And that
mm.
also, again, has an effect. So there's a lot of hypocrisy there, won't you say? And how did you go about reading this
Mm,
historical nugget while
mm,
writing the
mm,
story?
mm. I mean, this historical nugget is a part and parcel of our daily lives in Assam, in the sense we have a colloquial term called kanya.
Huh,
So kanya means someone who has partaken in kani.
huh,
So kani means opium, right? So you see, like, we have such a strong colloquial connect to the word because it was an intrinsic part of our social fabric, as opposed to this very dominant colonial narrative that the Assamese were an indolent population, they are always partaking in opium, and isliye unse kuch kaam nahi hota. This aspect is now really being contested by revisionist
hmm,
historians. So I was reading some of these papers in course of my history, and I felt that this is another aspect of Assam's history that needs telling, or rather retelling,
hmm,
because opium was not just used as like a drug in with which everyone was stoned and high all the time in
hmm,
Assam. There were some ritual usages, there were a lot of medicinal usages, and also in Assam, anything herbal has a very strong placement in our culinary traditions also. Like
huh,
during Bihu, we
hmm,
have more than 100 different greens on our
hmm,
plates. So when I thought about this story, I got very excited about these. These, how do I say, very eccentric bringing together of several elements. Especially, I wanted to highlight, underscore the absolute abject hypocrisy of the British Empire in
hmm,
this process, because you see, they banned the private cultivation of opium. But if temperance, if altruism was their motive, then they should have just kept it at that, no?
hmm,
But no, they instead introduced abkari opium, which is excise opium. So
hmm,
essentially, what one could just have for free, now it had to be purchased from licensed dealers.
yeah, yeah,
So anything that would feed their purses was okay. So altruism had a price tag on it for the
huh,
British
huh,
Empire, and it's time that we just say it as it is.
yeah, yeah. Actually, my favorite chapter though was the one on Ursula Graham Bauer. Okay, and am I pronouncing her name
Yes,
correctly?
yes.
So this also was a great chapter, a great lesson on creativity, I thought, because she was a real person,
Mm.
and you have the entire chapter. She's literally the protagonist almost
Mm.
of
A
the
silent kind of a
a silent
protagonist. Yeah.
protagonist of the chapter. Um, One, if you could tell our audiences a little more
Mm.
about who she was, because
Mm.
she's quite a fascinating
Mm.
character. But also, how did you weave fiction with
Mm.
somebody that real
Mm.
in writing that story?
So you see, because this work is a work of historical fiction, that means that there's a lot of research that went into
Hmm.
its writing.
Hmm.
So in course of my research, I was reading a lot of sources, and also a lot of primary sources.
Hmm.
So one of the primary sources I was reading was authored by Ursula herself. Like, it was like a travelogue, like an account of her stay in
Hmm.
Assam, Assam of that
Mm.
time. And so that's how I stumbled upon Ursula. And when I read her words, I was absolutely fascinated, because here is a woman of
Mm.
the 30, I mean, who is an anthropologist, a British female anthropologist, who chooses to travel all the way, not to like a very sort of glamorous, secure darbar of a mainland
Mm.
Raja, but she comes all the way to this frontier, wild, wild
Mm.
country,
Mm.
and to a village called Laisong village, which is now situated in the modern day Dima Hasao district.
Okay. Mm.
So it's an autonomous,
Mm.
area. Now the point is that this was so fascinating. So when I read her account, I, of
Mm.
course, had like a glimpse into her telling of her time there.
Mm.
So I could sort of comprehend a little bit on how she must have felt being around those people, because she explicitly mentions, very astute observations
Mm.
of like the region, the Zeminaga community with whom she cohabited for a very
Mm.
long time. And so this sort of her telling, it allowed me the creative freedom to write a fictitious story around her, because not a lot of people know about Ursula
Mm.
Graham Bauer. In
Yeah.
fact, it was in course of my own research I found out she is the aunt of veteran BBC journalist Mark Tully,
Oh.
who unfortunately just very recently
Mm.
passed away.
Mm.
So you see, again, it goes back to how we are more connected than
Connected. Yeah.
disconnected.
Yeah.
Fascinating, fascinating woman comes all the way to Laisong village in modern day Dima Hasao district to set up a watch and ward guerrilla unit against the invading Japanese during the Second World
Mm.
War. We don't even hear such stories now that often. And to
Yeah.
have this placed in the 30s and
Yeah.
40s, it
Mm.
was just mind blowing for me. And I
Mm.
just
Mm.
had to put this in my book.
Yeah, yeah, and
Yeah.
I mean, I absolutely love that chapter, and I want to read more about her, having read this story
Mm,
in your book. Again, the chapter which also connects Assam to the 65 China, India-China war.
mm, mm,
That also I found to be very fascinating. How the
mm,
threat of invasion
mm,
of the Chinese,
mm,
how
mm,
people are running helter
mm,
skelter, and
mm,
the kind of impact it has.
mm.
Again, what or how did you go about researching
Mm,
that,
mm,
putting that in fictional
mm,
form as
mm,
well? But there are
mm,
also real events
mm,
involved in
mm.
this.
Absolutely,
Mm.
absolutely. So, like I said, very deliberate design, because in the telling of stories from my frontier region, I also wanted to somehow highlight that in being frontier, in being a margin, it was also connected to so many other nations, in that
Yeah.
sense, like, not that this connection was always good,
Mm.
like, so for instance, the Chinese aggression in the Nefa area, we
Mm.
would call it, no,
Mm.
the northeast
Mm.
frontier. So this is not something that happened very far removed from the frontier. This was part of it,
Yeah.
right? So the Chinese, and I grew up listening to these stories, like we all, most of us who grew up in Assam knew that, there's a pond in this town called Tezpur. Tezpur is it's 4.5 hours drive away from Guwahati, the
Mm.
capital. And I also went to boarding school in
Achha.
Tezpur
Mm.
town. So, so we've grown up with these stories that, when do you know the story behind this pond? When the Chinese entered this area, this
Mm.
part of our country, the bank managers of this bank, they actually poured all the coins and all the money into this pond. So we grew up listening to these things. And
Mm.
also, like I said, I grew up in a boarding school, and my house mistress at that point was from that community. She was from that Chinese diaspora. Yeah, yeah,
Oh,
very fascinating. It was
okay.
my first experience, with that, because also this would make for a complicated conversation, this
Huh.
whole abuse that northeasterners face. Unfortunately, very recently we had this incident of Angel Chakma, that, oh,
Mm.
you look Chinese.
Yeah.
I mean, okay, and we are always having to defend that, ha, hum Chinese nahi hai.
Mm.
But the point is, there are different ways of looking, there are different ways of being, there are different ways of just, there are different ways for us to be. And that and that is not sort of that is not like a how do I say, like a signal to be violated, you see.
Hmm.
So we have people who look a certain way in Assam. In, you know,
Yeah.
they have that look in Assam, and it brings with it, this look brings with it dense, beautiful history of movement, of people's movement, you know.
Hmm.
So my house mistress, she wasn't from a particular tribe of Assam that looks that way. In fact, she draws her ancestry from the Chinese, you know. So these are the things that I wanted to bring forth through storytelling. And
Hmm.
a very, very real incident that we would keep talking about is, you know, when the Chinese entered through Nefa, apparently, because there was no administration that time, there was a full
Hmm.
to collapse, you know, so no civil administration, no police administration that time. So we have this very famous mental hospital in Tezpur. So the inmates, for lack
Hmm.
of a better word, were let loose in that
Okay.
sense, you
Huh.
know. So apparently, you know, they went around town screaming China Zindabad, because they considered that to be their point of liberation.
Liberation.
So I grew up with these stories, just like
Hmm.
many of my fellow Assamese, and I wanted to document these things with a
Hmm.
fascinating story. And if you notice that this story is again from a very personal lens of how these colossal global things are right by our verandas. In
Yeah.
Assamese way, it's in our
Hmm.
sutal, you know.
Hmm.
So yeah, this was the intention behind it.
Okay. There are also, in majority of the stories, I also saw that you blend social issues
Mm,
with history,
mm,
uh, in a fictional format as well, of course. Uh, like for instance, there's that story in which you blend homosexuality with peasant rebellion, and
mm.
again, a very interesting story. It's called Devotional Defiance, right? My question to you is that why did you choose to have homosexuality to tell a story of peasant rebellion? What are
Mm,
the
mm,
strands you're drawing from?
mm, mm. So you see, I mean, if I were to answer it very precisely,
Hmm.
why these two, and you've yourself termed it,
Hmm.
it's the peasant rebellion. And we see, unfortunately, with the queer population, there is always so much to rebel at first. There is
Hmm.
always so much to claim. There is so much to resist. This There's always so much, how do I say, like, it's almost a battle on so many fronts just for the queer population's right to exist like everyone else. And it's
Hmm.
a fundamental human right to be able to exist the way you
Hmm.
want to exist, is my personal
Hmm.
thought process. So when I was so this was again like, I felt it would be interesting to show like a sort of institutionalized rebellion in that sense. It's not
Hmm.
okay, maybe institutionalized is not the right
Hmm.
term, but it's a recognized rebellion, not too organized but not too disorganized, but it was organized enough to be earning the epithet that it's one of the first peasant resistance to the colonial sort of oppression
Hmm.
in Assam, the Phulaguri Dhawa. So I sort of then connected the community to the in person, because the
Hmm.
main protagonist there, Pradeep, he is also sort of coming on his own, you know, coming
Hmm.
into his own,
Hmm.
because he is also defying the things that are sort of putting him, relegating him to a background of existence, to a shadow of existence. So he is also in the telling of his own struggle to break free.
Hmm.
So he is also rebelling, no?
Yeah.
So the person and then the community. So I wanted to tie the two factors through the sort of platform of resistance.
Hmm.
So this was why I brought the two things together.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay. Very
yeah.
interesting. There's a one thing about that is has been spoken about a lot in the last few years, which is the illegal uh, immigration in Assam from Bangladesh, and we know the anti-CAA protests that had erupted in 2019, and the developments that happened thereon. There is a chapter alliances that in which you speak about the Assam Accord, which sort of
Mm,
was a beginning point to many of these political conversations around illegal immigration in
Mm,
Assam.
mm,
Um, but what I want to ask you is that what was the impact of this accord and the movement that was happening in Assam on in the personal lives of the people there, with
mm,
some of which I saw coming out in your story.
mm,
But if you can tell me a little bit more about it,
mm,
having grown up in Assam as well, what was the impact of the movement
mm.
on the personal lives of the Assamese people?
So you see, I mean, this would again make for a very long and complex conversation
Hmm,
because why? I mean, the movement, of course, had a colossal impact uh,
hmm,
on Assam, and it's something that we see very much alive today. Yeah, as we
hmm,
speak, we have that narrative going on in Assam. But you see, the 80s were also the time of the infamous Nelly massacre,
hmm,
where a lot of Bengali speaking Muslims were massacred and hacked to death. So, my intention behind this story was more sort of a personal reflection on the Assam that I know and I love. I wherever I go, wherever I speak, I about Assam, I very intentionally and with a lot of love say this, that Assam is perhaps one of the most syncretic pluralistic societies out there, where despite being a home for multiple ethnicities, religions, we've somehow always blended in with the idea that we are Assamese,
hmm,
a very pluralistic society. Of course, right now, I would want to flag that a little bit because of certain climates that are being
hmm,
created more rapidly than I would like to, believe. And so when like I said, I was working in the Assam government for a while, and I was in that sense, I went back home. But I felt slightly disconnected from that home because it wasn't feeling the way the Assam of my father's time would feel,
hmm,
so I went back very intentionally to Golaghat town. My mom and dad come from Golaghat.
hmm,
Golaghat is a small town from Upper Assam, and I grew up there. I would go there almost every summer, winter vacation to spend time with my grandparents. And this is a locale, an area from my being, I would say, where I would see a lot of this pluralism. Like, right now I sometimes encounter, this sort of confusion, and it's fast increasing ethnicity versus religiosity.
hmm.
For instance, Bihu is not a Hindu festival, it's the
Yeah,
festival of Assam.
yeah.
I am a Sunni Muslim woman.
Hmm,
I cannot wait to celebrate Bihu. Just like during Eid, my house is bustling with my Assamese Hindu friends and my Assamese Muslim friends.
hmm,
So you see, like, very harmonious. And I remember, and this story is also set in like Bihu time,
yeah,
and I talk about these very porous boundaries of like bent fences.
yeah.
It's symbolic of the literal non existence of these solidified identity based fences
Hmm,
between people. So I wanted to go back to this very much so. And I wanted people through this story to also revisit that time so as to not confuse and not to partake in certain confusions that are permeating in my society right now.
hmm. Actually, the climax of this chapter where the two women are making pitas for Bihu before they
Mm,
break out into the fight
mm, mm,
is again very interesting.
mm,
How they both were doing it together.
mm,
And I'm sure it was intentional to
mm.
show that background before they
Yeah,
break
yeah.
out in the
And in
fight.
fact, I'm so pleased to also like talk about this story
Hmm,
in this forum
hmm,
because as a first time author, I'm so nervous that
hmm,
okay, ab
hmm.
kitab to likh liya, iska matlab ab log padhenge. So I'm so nervous about this. And also another added layer of stress is like, okay, this is very regional, this
Hmm,
thing is about Assam. It's my love letter to
yeah.
Assam
Hmm,
in that sense. And I was a bit worried about whether the rest of the readers, non-Assamese reader, would be able to relate. A lot of my non-Assamese reader have like spoken to me very fondly about this chapter. So I'm very excited to
yeah.
learn of how people are receiving this chapter, and it's
Yeah.
very heartwarming for me as a
Of course.
first-time author
Mhm.
to see this.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
sure. And we'll end this conversation with the chapter. on which the name of this book is also kept, which is Color My Grave Purple. And I think it's a fascinating title, by the way. Is this chapter also autobiographical? Because that is the sense I got. Slightly, is it autobiographical? Tell me a little bit about how you went about putting together this chapter and why did you name it so?
Partly autobiographical, partly
Yeah.
not. Let's just keep a bit of mystery alive
Of
about
course, yeah.
this. It's a very personal reasoning behind choosing this title. Uh, Color My Grave Purple, the grave and the purple are tied to my father's death. So when I was 16, I lost my father, and I come from a Muslim household. I am a Muslim woman from Assam.
Mm.
And when he passed away, a lot of extended family members, well wishers, would come up to me and tell me, "Oh, you know what? You're so lucky that your father is buried at the periphery of the
Mm.
graveyard. You
Mm.
know, this
Mm.
graveyard is right in the middle of Guwahati city." I said, "Why? Why is this a good news for me?" They said, "So you can peek in." You know, I said, "Why will I peek in? I'm his daughter. I will go to his grave."
Mm.
And while I understand it's all bones, but at the same time, there is inevitably an attachment to your loved one's grave, no?
Mm.
So they said, "No, of course you cannot go because it's banned by the Sharia." I was like, "What? Since when?" You know? So I was 16 at that time. Blood is hotter than it is right
Mm.
now. And I used to rebel a lot, but not to it didn't lead to much, those early years of rebellion.
Mm.
Like I would wake up very early, go there to the graveyard, try to hop over the fence, try to just stay there until the guard would come, then I would run out. And then eventually life happened and I came out to study and I went all over the world and ye hua wo hua, kuch ban ke jaungi main, you know. You're not letting me, the society is not giving me access to my own father's grave, main sabko dikha dungi, you know, that
Mm.
classical rebellion that you have as a younger person. And I had the same. And I remember when I went back as a assistant commissioner of my district, and I felt I had arrived in that sense, you know, a bit of a
Mm.
naive thought process, I would say. I felt I arrived, and you know, then I my father and I shared this love, common love of very cheesy love of velvety red roses. So I had taken 13, I think I remember 13 rose stems to visit his grave. And as I tried to enter, the guard had come out and he said, "You are not, you will not be allowed in." And I tried to resist. And then when I tried to resist, he said, "We will have to take action," which meant that he said, "Mohalla utha ke launga" types, you know, ki tumko pitenge hum. It really broke me. It broke me on so many levels. It broke me very deeply. And all the sense of empowerment I felt by then in my life, it shattered right before my eyes. And then I felt that, okay, when I started writing the book, this story just fell on me, you know, that I'm writing so much about Assam and I'm now trying to write something a bit personal. uh, I would think about my father. Like, you know, I recall when I was very young, because he was a police officer, he would go from battalion to battalion. He was a naturalist, he would plant trees. And this purple comes from the azar tree. Azar in Assamese, queen crepe myrtle in English, has beautiful purple blossoms. My father he used to love this tree. And I recall hearing him say that to someone, that, you know, I never get to see the fruit of this labor, you know, because before this tree can start flowering, you know, I'm transferred out, of course. And then when I was weaving this story, I sort of fictitiously, without giving in too much, giving out too much rather, fictitiously sort of made the purple his last canopy over his grave. And by keeping his grave as a titular story, I felt that if I'm not allowed as his daughter to visit his grave, which by now is very bizarre for me because I live and work as an international humanitarian
Mm.
worker in war zones, which a significant Muslim population. I've worked in Syria, I've worked in Lebanon, I've worked in Jordan, and I've gone and prayed over the graves of Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims, Alawi Muslims, you know, Ismaili Muslims. I have unfettered access, but I don't have access to my own father's grave.
Mm.
So I feel that if I can't, then maybe through my book, the
Yeah.
world will travel, the world will serenade him. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Shanab. I know we're ending on a very
Mm,
emotional note. I must say that, I absolutely loved
mm.
reading your
Thank you.
book. It's of course creativity wrapped with a lot of historical information that many people would not know about Assam. We often associate Assam with certain very stereotypical understandings of history, of the AFSPA and of insurgency and things like that. But this broadens our canvas. And thanks a lot to you
Mm,
for writing something so beautiful, for writing,
thank you.
broadening our understanding of Assam. And to the audience here, if you want to read more, please do get hold of this book. Read more about Shanab's Assam and how the beautiful interconnections the state has with not just with other parts of India, but also with the rest of the world. Thank you for watching. And if you enjoyed this video and would like to watch more such conversations with authors and other experts, do follow indianexpress.com.